Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 2022. My name is Gunnar Larsen, the Director of Danish UK Association, and together with the Finnish-British Chamber of Commerce and Goodwille, we're pleased to finally be back again and present some good knowledge to you, all the members and the wider network. We're here to discuss the future of work and how to manage the transition back to the office, or however we're going to do it. Just a few house rules, first of all. You'll notice that you are all muted and cameras taken off. We've done that. However, it does give you still a chance to ask questions, and please for that use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, most likely it's going to be. That is also the place you're going to put in any kind of issues. You might have technical issues during this webinar. I'm pleased to say we're joined by Hannah from Goodwille, who will check out those and try to help to the best of her ability on doing that. The session will also be recorded, and we will be sharing it post-event with you all and a wider network. Briefly about the chambers, Finnish-British Chamber of Commerce and the Danish UK Association. We are all about connecting people and fostering these relationships between the Nordic countries and the UK and vice versa. And we're really pleased that we can do another event like this with Goodwille, who's a member at both the organizations, as an example of how we, with the joint knowledge and know-how you have in the organizations here, to the benefit of all. So do profit as much as possible. Goodwille is a UK-based business specializing in supporting small and medium-sized businesses who are scaling, moving, extending their business to the UK. They supply a full suite of support services, including corporate governance, finance, HR, payroll, and virtual office. And it's their HR team that is joining us here today. And for that, I will now ask them to turn on the cameras so people have a chance to see who are here. We are joined by Jacqui, who is the HR manager at Goodwille, and also two of her colleagues, Anni Glesaaen and Winchester, HR advisors, Goodwille. The topic we will be exploring is hot and emotive in many ways, on how business return to the new normal working environment. You're hopefully finding ways we can do business past the pandemic. We have all settled into new working practices and routines over the pandemic, some good and some less good. So how do you businesses make decisions on what is best for your business and your workforce, balancing productivity and employee health and happiness in this new world when we consider flexible working and hybrid working? And to start this, we have prepared a little poll. And I'm going to ask Hannah to put up the poll, and I'm going to explain it while you see it. Basically, we thought it would be a good idea to get your feedback here right now as a business. Which model do you think you will move into in the future, looking ahead now? Is it going to be a hybrid working, partly working from home, partly working from the office? Is it going to be 100% remote-based? Or are you going to continue using the flexible working request process to deal with this request? Please take a moment to enter your vote, and we're going to take it down in a few seconds. But maybe, Jacqui, I could ask you to give you some thoughts to these three options. Why is it that we have these three options? In particular, for me, it's the last one, which to me is not a known.
Yeah, so I mean, we're obviously going to be talking about this a lot today anyway, but for sure it's been a hot topic in the media, what our business is going to be doing. We have heard a lot, particularly from the tech giants, that they do want to move to more of a 100% remote-based model. They may have done some U-turns there. Hybrid working, of course, we've all been working from home, haven't we? So, you know, it would seem reasonable that businesses would allow that balance. But the flexible working request processes are already in situation. But there will be some changes probably from the government in future about how that will be working.
Cool. Hannah, well, you answered my question there already. What is your immediate response to this, Jacqui? I guess it's not too surprising here.
I'm quite surprised by actually the choice of continuing using the flexible working request process, because that would indicate that whoever has responded, that the two persons who responded to this aren't entertaining hybrid working at all, which is kind of bucking the trend, I guess, from what we're hearing in the marketplace.
Cool. So maybe some comments for whoever put those in there in the question Q&A. So maybe we can consider those a little bit later in the session. But with that, let's kick it off. Today's webinar we're going to try to do as a fireside chat, so we can have a little bit of different perspectives from the panel of experts here today. And we have 4 sections we're going to try to go through, so cover a little bit from a broad perspective. And at the end, we're then going to go into Q&A. And many of you have already sent some excellent questions that we're going to go through. But do also put your questions into the Q&A, and we're going to try to consider as many of those as possible. And at a later stage, if not already, Hannah will also paste in our contact details. So if you feel like you didn't get your question sorted at today's event, or you want to take a direct bilateral approach to any of us here with your questions to get it sorted, please do so. So moving on. What is the current landscape? What are businesses doing in a post-pandemic world in terms of returning to a physical workplace? What is the future likely to look like? Who would like to start that?
I'll jump in with this one, Gunnar. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's an interesting point, and you've sort of addressed my first comments, really, and that's to say that it is a very emotive subject. I think if you speak to anyone, they generally have, or there are some polarizing views, not just among business leaders and employees, but within employees and among business leaders themselves. So that is to say that what we find, or what we have found, I think, are some of the more heavily or traditionally heavily regulated industries, like some of the larger banks, big law firms or law offices, have been more keen to return to the sort of traditional or older ways of working. And I think that really does speak to the regulated nature of what some of these people tend to be involved with, and how difficult they have perhaps found it to truly embrace 100% home working as kind of the new normal. But just to pick up on another point that you made, it's important when we talk about hybrid and flexible working, that can encompass a few different things. And my colleagues will sort of jump in further through the presentation, but we might not necessarily just be talking about either a fully remote or office-based role. You know, hybrid work, by its very sort of name and definition, can encompass things like working compressed hours, working and having staggered work and finish times. And the sort of quintessential part really is about flexibility and looking at things that might work for an individual. And whatever the case, the most important thing that businesses really need to do is to make sure that they have robust, sensible policies that they can discuss and agree with their employees. And I think that will put them in a really good position. And now is the time to start to put that together if they haven't already done so.
Yeah, and very good. My name is Anni, as you know, and we have already heard so much about hybrid working, and this is the kind of a new norm we got into. But then already somebody has moved on to something called polyworking, and that is a working landscape which is even more complex than just working in the office now and then or working from home. So it's not about blending the two locations together. It's actually about allowing the individuals to be able to construct a professional life, which is actually wrapped around them under their circumstances. But the poly itself is because there's many variations to the working patterns, which then can be used. One of the companies who's already worked or moved into this poly working scenario is Pfizer, and they focus on the individual in a much wider sense. For example, they have with their management already consolidated their style by underpinned by trust, flexibility, and autonomy. They say that their staff work extremely hard, but they are empowered and trusted to get the work done in a time and way that suits them personally. The manager focus more on the outcome, not on actually the work and the hours worked. And as we know, in reality, if you are empowered and trusted or given that to people, you know that they will give much more in return to you. But today's focus will be much more on the hybrid working. But as an example, we are also already moving further.
Oh, that's really interesting, Anni, because of course, all sorts of flexible or hybrid working is going to require trust. And I think that comes from both the employee and the employer, really. Of course, with Omicron and the advice that we've had to work from home if you can, there's been a halt on many companies taking up these more flexible working plans, and we've been thrust into a 100% home working again, as we know, and Goodwille is no exception to that. Of course, we had a hybrid working model in place and we had to press pause on that in December, like a lot of companies had to. But certainly when the government advice does change from our research, there does seem to be a shift for sure from companies changing from 100% home working to now trying some level of return to work in the office. And as you've both touched on, Rob and Anni, there is definitely a mix of preferences in the workplace. Some companies are choosing 100% home working, others 100% on-site work. And of course, that's clearly going to make sense if the job just can't be carried out at home. We obviously need to remember that as well. But most recently, we've seen that Google, I know I touched on briefly when we did the poll, we talked about the tech giants, and Google had been one of those companies that had initially championed a flexible working approach. Not to say that they're not, but the most recent news from them is that the plan is to reinvigorate its work environment. So they've just bought a new site in London. And they're keen to see everyone back in the office again. So the plan with Google is that they're going to have less densely populated workspaces. They're focusing on collaborative spaces. They're even going to be having a covered outdoor workspace. So if we're thinking about, COVID risk assessments, which are going to be going nowhere anytime soon, obviously they're bearing that in mind to be able to argue the point that they're going to get people safely back in the office. But they are going to be looking at a plan of 3 days in the office for their hybrid model. And then, of course, we've got the flexible working requests. That was part of our poll as well. So flexible working is something that's been around for years. Of course, employees have a statutory right each year to make a request. There are various rules and regulations around that, but there's been a recent government consultation to make flexible working a day one right. This isn't the law at this time, just to be clear, but there have been some studies issued by CIPD where they did look at companies and what their current flexible working policies were. And although a third of firms currently accept flexible working requests as a day one right, the actual research is quite interesting because it shows out of that 57% of businesses agreed that flexible working should be a day one right, but only 36% of them currently accept it. So there's a bit of an anomaly between what they're accepting and what they actually feel is correct. And also the support for this is actually higher in the public sector than in private, and also with larger organisations rather than smaller organisations. So that's quite interesting as well. But going back to hybrid working, there's a lot of openness and noise about this. The general consensus is mainly that there is increased flexibility and that's been well received by employees. There's a better level of work-life balance, of course, and that's going to be crucial in terms of maintaining staff morale and staff retention as we move forward. So if you can accommodate flexible working or hybrid working and you don't move with the times and you decide that you're not going to allow it, then ultimately your competitors will be willing to do so, and then ultimately you will risk losing some valuable members of staff. But there is the balance. I'm sure that we're going to talk about this a lot more because we've all in this group got our differing views on this topic. It's not going to be a perfect solution for all businesses. Some might see more drawbacks than others. Some roles may be more difficult to undertake from home, even on a part-time basis. Managers need to take that into account. Of course, we need to think about mental health as well, and the fact that some staff may feel more isolated when working from home. So, hybrid work, it may go somewhat towards mitigating this issue, but it's certainly not a perfect solution. And then there's the whole having the tools to manage your staff. Staff can be more difficult to manage remotely. Maybe there is some level of encouragement to see them in the there is maybe some element of maybe, getting them into the office where you can actually physically see them on days where it's going to be relevant. It's not just a tick box exercise. We're just trying to overcome that potential that when staff are working from home, they may actually just work less hard, or maybe that's the perception. So we need to actually have the tools in place to be able to manage and monitor those staff in those situations, and be prepared to take action should there be any potential for their, maybe being a bit slacking when working from home, or if that's the perception. But of course, Goodwille can help there if you need it.
That's good. Sorry, can I?
You go ahead. No, I was just wondering if any of you, Robert or Annie, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up, Jacqui, on what you were talking about in terms of well-being, and it's really good, I think, that in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly, we've seen such a big emphasis placed on mental health in particular and employee well-being at large. And it's really interesting that you talk about this perhaps being an area that companies will find themselves competing over. Who can be the most flexible, who perhaps has the best hybrid option. And it's really interesting to me that companies, I think, at the moment are perhaps looking at a solution which is a bit of a one-size-fits-all. But actually, the very nature of hybrid and flexible working means that that's kind of the wrong way to think about this. But just to kind of pick up on the well-being aspect, I think you raise a really good point that it might not always be as straightforward to spot somebody who perhaps is in some kind of mental distress, or who's really suffering with having to work from home, even if it's only for 2 or 3 days a week. Throughout the pandemic, we're all very familiar with circumstances where people are perhaps sort of locked down with 2 or 3 children in a small flat or something like that, and that obviously presents significant challenges. And whilst I think lots of people are much more comfortable with bringing those to HR professionals, or to their line managers or whoever, people really need to have some, a good amount of training and understanding on perhaps some of the physical signs of mental distress and some behavioral signs that somebody might be really struggling with home working. You might see things really obviously in the office, but actually they're a bit more subvert when working from home. So really being tuned into what your employees perhaps are going through will just help to manage and perhaps put in something which is a bit more bespoke, which I think employees generally really, really like to see. One thing that I've noticed whilst being with Goodwille, and I know we have one in place at the moment, we have a buddy system. It's a system whereby somebody who's not in my team or our team, somebody in another part of the business, just has an interest in particular with new joiners or people who are sort of freshly onboarded, perhaps somebody who is gone and come back from a recent period of absence or something similar, somebody who's a bit of a touch point, who can help maintain a personal relationship with the company while everybody is sort of stuck at home, or even if they have chosen to be at home. That's sort of quintessential and something that's been really well received. And something else, and I know lots of companies have taken this up, and there's been a lot of interest on our side, it is the mental health first aid program. Everybody will be familiar, I'm sure, with the first aid and the health and safety induction that we all go through when we join a new company, and here are the fire exits and everything else. But there is a big uptake in mental health first aid training. And I think this is really, really positive. And I think if hybrid working is a principle which underpins this new impetus into well-being, then that will stand companies in very good stead for how we go forwards.
Interesting. I think actually it may give an opportunity here for, if you run the budget system that you are doing, you have a chance to meet some colleagues in your business that you probably wouldn't do otherwise, because on a day-to-day basis in the office, you probably stick to your corner. and beat the ones around you. But now ever so often you can variate and you can get to meet new colleagues or reintroduce.
Absolutely. We have other initiatives, like we do a coffee roulette, and it's names in a hat, and you pull out somebody that perhaps you didn't even know was in the organization. Yeah. And we really encourage that, and I'm sure Jacqui and Anni will back me up and say that that's been an overwhelmingly positive experience.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's just a really good plan, even when you were geographically dispersed pre-pandemic, but it's been super useful, particularly when we've had new joiners over the course of the last couple of years, when we've all been unable to mix in person. It's been super useful.
Yeah, and
I think we should. No, sorry, go ahead, Anni, for brief.
I just wanted also to add that it's very, very good for when you're a new starter, you might not be the likely one to actually reach out and be in touch with somebody. So it's very important that it puts emphasis on us who's been in the organization to actually help with that onboarding and feeling welcomed and be part of the team from the beginning.
I think we're going to come back to that some of the questions, because you're touching on something really important here that basically makes every business turn around, that we have this good relations going on. Moving on to make sure we cover the key things we want to cover, can you outline some key considerations for businesses who want to adjust their standard working practice when it comes to rejecting or embracing a more flexible working environment?
Yeah, I could start off on that one. Of course, we all want to look after the employees' well-being and actually give them some kind of flexibility. And I guess at the moment, there is definitely a discrepancy between what the employee would like to do, maybe going forward, and where the employee sees where they would like to be. But before we actually touch on that, first we have to acknowledge that we all have been in a hybrid working model, more or less, over the last 2 years. And we have, of course, then had colleagues in maybe different countries, different time zones, different cultures, and all that have to be taken into account going forward on how you would like your organization to look like. And also, we can all probably say that it has been a success, the way we have actually been able to get through our hybrid working so far, but probably also because what other option did we have? There wasn't much of another option. So we have all been in more or less the same boat, and it has been a feeling of camaraderie to actually get there. But before the organization maybe do a proper stance on where they would like to go and what kind of offering they would like to look at, it's very important that they maybe look at a sturdy business case, that they look at actually what would we like to look at going forward. So there might be a few questions they would like to raise. And one of them could be like, it's a lot interrelated questions in this. It's not just one or two, but of course they all filter into each other. But what is the real cost of hybrid working to our bottom line? That is, of course, at the bottom for all organizations. If you don't have the finances at the end of the day, of course, it's not viable. And if they do, can they actually deliver on the promises which is actually set out to the clients and customers and who they serve? And who's going to make the decision on who's actually going to be able to work remote and not? And can they also maintain a culture when you do have hybrid working and not spending so much time together in the office? The other thing which you have touched on a little bit here now with my colleagues is actually the onboarding. Will that be efficiently? And can we actually do it in a good way so they all feel included in the beginning? So it's a complex issue, and there's a lot of challenges included here. So there's not just one single discussion. And there's actually, when you look at it, 3 discussions in disguise here. And then discussion could be around the staffing, productivity, and the culture of the business. And again, all these 3, of course, have their own objectives, supporters, and arguments, which then again have to look into. So if we, for example, look at the productivity, some people would say that if you are based in an office, you're working side by side, it's more rapid to send information between each other and between the team, which can't be matched if you work remotely. While others say maybe that they are much more productive when they're given the freedom to actually control the time and the space where they're working than actually being forced to be in an office. So the organization, of course, need to just look at what is actually the optimal form and mix of working arrangements which they need to deliver on the commitments they have as a business. When it comes to the staffing, as we know, it has changed all of us in terms of what is our expectations and desire for how we would like to work going forward. And like Jacqui touched on very early on, is that if the companies doesn't follow on and actually give flexibility in some sort, they might lose out on retain and attract new talents, which is very important. And of course, the culture, like we said, that how can we actually instill our norms and maintain values and, and beliefs. We have historically, of course, had that by firsthand by being together and experienced it as a group. If you now are actually in dispersed team or actually geographically all over the place, how can we actually maintain that? And as we know, a lot of the culture is also quietly understood and even subconscious. So how can we look at that going forward? I think it is very important that you take a process-based approach to maximize the likelihood, which is needed to find the balance you need for your customers, for your employees, and for your organization. And as we know that today's market, which is very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, that it is very incredibly complex and it will continue to change. Whatever you choose is not going to stay. And if you think you got it right the first time, I think that will be very unrealistic to think that it will stay that way. You really have to be on the evolving path to make sure that everything is met and everyone is looked after.
It's really no different. It has been you always had to look after your staff. Robert, Jacqui?
Yeah. And I would agree with what you said there, Annie, about obviously the planning process. That, of course, is key to any good business plan. And of course, there's a number of good reasons for asking employees to come back to the office. Practicality-wise, we even just need to look at employees' contracts of employment, which generally would stipulate that they're based from an office or place of work other than home. But we can, of course, change those with consultation. So they are not going to be your fail-safe justification for why you might want to force your employees back into the workplace without any additional planning. We want to, of course, as a company, foster collaborative working. And there's a good argument to be made that innovation happens when staff get together. I think that's quite an obvious thing to say, really. And this can be missed when you've got a displaced workforce. But really, we need to be thinking about, or you need to be asking questions, can the company reasonably justify that innovation can't happen in a virtual setting? Of course, we've survived the last couple of years doing exactly that, haven't we? And businesses have had to problem solve where they've been faced with these issues. So how might the company evidence this type of objection to remote working? And would this stand up if it was challenged in a legal setting? Because this is what your business plan is all about. If you're going to be challenged on your business plan, you need to be able to objectively justify the decisions that you have made for all of the elements that Annie's spoken about before. So Annie, you spoke about a global sense of camaraderie over the pandemic. We've all been supporting one another working from home, but now the company could possibly argue that actually we're not in the same boat now. There is a mix of office work and home working. And so 100% home working is no longer the case. So if you do have a business plan that says you want at least some element of office working, and then you then have an employee digging down and refusing to attend the workplace at all, then the company could argue as one element that that the situation has changed, the work environment is now not what it was, it's only temporary, or it was only temporary, sorry, and so it's necessary to adjust your plans again, as Annie touched on. We've got to also think about management techniques. So of course, we've always been used to managing in person in the main. We've had, team meetings, which are, of course, all vital for collaboration. But again, how can you objectively justify that we can't achieve the same goals from a virtual setting? And that's why, you want to bring people back to work. So maybe devise a strategy for carrying out tasks which can be carried out at home perfectly well. And then those collaborative tasks should be based on in-office work. And that way is maybe a way to demonstrate and support this business case if you do want to go for a hybrid or flexible working operation, rather than just allowing 100% homework.
Rob, do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, just I think it's an interesting point that Jacqui makes. Sorry. Oh, can you hear me any better? Much better. Okay, good. Dodgy headset. I apologize, everyone. I think it's a really valuable point that Jacqui makes, that it's not necessarily just the employees who perhaps feel the pinch when it comes to the challenges of being remotely based or being at home. Annie mentioned onboarding earlier, and I myself was a new starter only 6 months ago to Goodwille. So it's I'm sort of well versed in how difficult it can potentially be. But also not just for new employees, we need to think about those who have management responsibilities or business owners who are perhaps looking at a period of hyper growth where perhaps they need to bring on 10 people into a team or something like that. If you have let's say a 50-50 split within that new team of remote workers and office workers, are you likely going to achieve the same results? And are those who are at home going to get up to speed as quickly, perhaps, as those who are all together in a cohort in the office? And that really is a question that companies need to ask themselves. And I think the lens really needs to be focused internally just to find out and address some of those questions and overcome those hurdles. And both my colleagues have already identified the fact that should companies fail to do so, then they perhaps put themselves at a significant risk. So that's something that's worth thinking about. And I suppose from my own personal experience, I think that the onboarding and the kind of new employee experience is a lot more challenging in a remote environment. There was a study that was undertaken by one of the big universities about how people like to learn. And they did say, or they did find that most people now, rather than sitting in a 3-hour lecture or training session, however you'd like it, may prefer more sort of bite-sized 15-20-minute videos because it allows information to sink in a more sort of manageable way. And companies really need to take a lot of the new studies and the new information and the insight that's come from the pandemic and from hybrid working to address the onboarding and the new employee experience.
I think you're already moving on. Sorry, Robert, to cut you off, because you're touching upon some things here now that we're going to be on to the next step about companies who want to embrace hybrid working or flexible working, and practical steps you need to take to ensure this can be rolled out successfully. So you're already looking at some lessons learned, and maybe I can encourage you, if not now but later, share any materials that people can tap into. But how can that be done as an organization? What are the process? What are the things they should be looking out for if they want to embrace this? If we can move on to that.
Sure. Well, I think the last point I'd make on that subject really is that as a manager, we need to be, or as a business owner, we need to be mindful that those with hiring responsibilities are enabled to properly look after and to govern people who may be onboarded in a hybrid working environment. I think that's the key sort of point that I'm making there. But of course, I can talk about that later, can I?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything you've said, Rob. And I think you've touched on there about the management and management styles as well. And I think that is going to be a key thing, in that there could potentially be a divide between managers' perceptions of performance in terms of people working from on a remote basis and those working in the office. There's a lot of talk about, when it comes to promotions, appraisals, and so on, will there be a perceived relationship between productivity and visibility? So it's that old presenteeism argument again. If those that maybe can't be seen, may be overlooked in some cases. So then there was someone from Bank of England, a lady named Catherine Mann, who's a senior policymaker, spoke out about this as well, basically expressing her concerns about it being mainly women who would be virtually working. And that ultimately she was concerned that there may be an imbalance there in terms of success at work because of this. So ultimately, she felt that because it would be mainly women that were virtually working, that virtual platforms are ultimately, of course, better than they were years ago, but there's still a way to go. And her main concern around this was that the spontaneous aspects of the workday would likely be missed in a virtual setting. And so ultimately, as an end result, women could potentially be disproportionately affected. Because, you know, effectively most businesses aren't necessarily set up as well to work in a virtual basis as they are 100% in office. So
I should just say to the listeners, sorry, Jacqui, to cut you off, because this is such a meaty topic here, and we want to make sure we don't skate across it too easily.
Yeah.
For the listeners, we're going to try to extend it until 11:30, absolutely latest, and by then we will be done. So for the ones of you who plan to leave at 1:15, that's fine. There will be recording, but otherwise, please stay on, and we will still get to the questions.
Cool. So I guess sort of the add-on to that, if we're talking about touching on from what we talked about a little earlier, if we're thinking about the business plan, you know, ultimately businesses need to bear in mind that, you know, we don't want portions of the or pools of the workforce to be disproportionately affected, like women, like people with disabilities and so on, who may end up being in a virtual setting when they're working. So when you're actually building your business plan, how can you build this into your working plan to protect those from working from home being on the second track, so to speak, when it comes to when it comes to promotions and so on? You don't want to be accused of discrimination. And ultimately, everyone's attitudes from working from home is going to differ. So it's important to consider that everyone's individual circumstances will largely influence their view on the viability of working from home as a long-term prospect. So just maybe think about individuals' needs for flexibility as well as the commercial needs of the business. Obviously, they do go hand in hand.
And I'm thinking to follow up on that one, Jacqui, when you look at the individual preferences and the personal circumstances, which is very important to look at if you want to make sure that you have the equality and inclusion in a hybrid working space. But if we go back to the business model, other things to maybe consider for a business point of view is, of course, to look at the types of roles and responsibilities within the organization. What kind of teams have you got? What kind of support is there? What kind of visibility is there? And the responsibilities around all this. That's on the people aspect. But then you as an organization can look at also, of course, do you have the budget for tech? Do you actually have the money set aside, or do you have that to actually make sure that there is a seamless run between in-house and remote working when it comes to the tech needed to carry out the job which is necessary? If you do move over to hybrid working, would you actually then have a chance to reduce the office space? Would that lead to reduced cost for you as a business? Would that be a positive way to go? And a strong IT, as we know, is very essential to actually be able to move forward if you're going to look at out of the office. But that is the organization points of. But if you then look at hybrid working and what you actually can gain as an organization in terms of new talent, because you can actually tap into maybe unused talent, which like new mums who wouldn't be able to maybe work in an office or move or travel. Maybe they could be a good extra source for you. What about the people with disabilities who is actually not able to or can travel on a daily basis? They will then definitely be able to apply for positions when they have more chance to work from home. And not at least the postgraduates. Maybe they don't have the finances to move into a big city. They can maybe stay at home. Maybe the parents doesn't want to, but at least they have a chance to, and they can actually get a good job from the starting ground. So all them little things is also very important to consider. The other things is that not everyone wants to be working in a hybrid model. And that also needs to be considered. Maybe somebody finds it very hard to actually set up and maintain 2 workstations, one at home and one in the office. Maybe they don't have the space for this. Maybe they should be allowed to travel in when we talked about wellness being, and maybe that is one of the reasons. Also, they might find it impossible to schedule tasks, what needs to be done and what kind of location to get the best meeting set up. Maybe they prefer face-to-face when the time is actually lifting, and compared to maybe do it over Zoom, for example. And like we said, people might actually fear that they will be forgotten about if they don't have the visibility, that people can't see them. Will they be actually discriminated against? So maybe they would definitely like to be in an office environment.
I guess there's also a cost element here in terms of not only technology, but also make sure you have the right seating, you're sitting there, have access to the right materials and whatever you need on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that something, there are some experience with as well on the cost. How do you divide up the cost? What can an employee expect to have covered at home vis-a-vis in the office?
So for example, if an employer says that part of your workplace should be at home, then of course the employer have a responsibility to provide them with whatever necessary equipment to carry out the job in the best possible way as they would do in an office. But it doesn't mean that they would have, for example, 3-4 monitors. It would still be maybe an extra monitor. It would be the laptop. Might not necessarily be that you would have a printer if you can actually do it digitally. But yeah, they have a responsibility to make sure that they are maintained in a good working position at home as well.
And actually work position, how does that work at the moment? I'm sitting slouching slightly because I'm sitting comfortably. How do you ensure as an employer that your staff is sitting properly, ergonomically correct?
No,
because you cannot go and push them in the back saying shape up a little bit.
No, exactly. Maybe you will jump in there, Jacqui.
Yeah, I mean, what we do at Goodwille is that, of course, we have an ergonomics diagram that we share with our employees. And of course, it's up to the employee to make sure that they are actually implementing that at home. But we do have a risk assessment as well. So we'll actually go through the risk assessment questionnaire, make sure they understand all of the elements. They have a checklist to make sure that they can check their workspace at home. Of course, it's always going to be up to the employee to make sure they're complying with it, but at least it's going somewhat in the right direction in terms of the company making the effort to ensure that the employees had the right equipment and the right understanding and training.
I think we need to move on because there are questions as well, and we want to make sure we cover some of those. So the last point we want to touch, and let's try to keep it brief and get people a chance to follow up with you separately afterwards. What do companies need to be mindful of when it comes to accusations of discrimination or discriminatory behavior in the workplaces, specifically when it comes to flexi working or hybrid working? That can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, so for sure, being clear with staff is important. Yeah, in terms of actually like what your business plan is going to be. I know we've touched about this briefly already, but you know what approach that you might decide is more appropriate for your business. You should make sure that you've got clear policies and procedures on hybrid working, flexible working, 100% office working. I know that Rob's talked about that earlier, but you also need to think about inclusion when designing those policies and working practices. Again, we touched on that a little bit before. So how are you monitoring those working from home? Remote working shouldn't mean a fall in productivity. So you need to make sure that, you know, you have some practical steps in place to ensure that employees are meeting any KPIs that you set. And, you know, you have got a duty of care to your employees in terms of their physical health as well as their mental health. So some ways that you can track performance standards would be things like timesheets, Zoom, team meetings, one-to-ones, more regular appraisals, making sure that you trust your employees and that you're not encouraging micromanaging practices. So that's all going to be ensuring that you are training your managers, which is something that a lot of companies fall foul of not doing. Definitely, you know, having clear objectives that are being set, asking for an account of daily and weekly stats. So, I mean, it just being, you know, fair to all so that you have a fair way of measuring. But if we're thinking about leadership and managing techniques as well, you know, we've touched on it earlier before, thinking about potential for employees feeling isolated. You know, are you as a manager engaging with that person as much as you should be? If you don't, are you just assuming that they're disengaged? You know, just because you don't see them popping up on a Zoom meeting or maybe contributing as much, are they not turning their camera on and that sort of thing? But maybe, you know, we are maybe seeing people being performance managed in scenarios where maybe they shouldn't be. And maybe a reason why they're not performing is because of your management technique. So, yeah, I think that's something that we need to be mindful of.
That's maybe some of the things that Rob, he touched upon on the body system and rotating on a regular basis. You would pick up on those nuances and changes in minds. Rob, sorry.
There were some really interesting statistics that came from the ONS, or the Office for National Statistics, looking at work. And one of them that I thought was particularly interesting was that people who completed any work from home in 21 generally did 6 hours of unpaid overtime on average per week, or in 2020, sorry, compared with 3.6 hours for those that were never working from home. So actually, it's really interesting, isn't it, when you look at the difference in perception. And actually, I think that when you speak to a lot of people who really sort of bang the drum for going back into the office, one of the arguments that I've heard lots is that actually I really enjoy my commute time. It gives me some time in the morning to prepare for work and some time in the evening to tune out and to stop thinking about work. And then when I'm home, I'm home. But actually, when we think about it, one of the potential pitfalls, I suppose, of working from home is that employees maybe don't have that because they are on all the time. And I know there's been some interesting legislative updates across Europe with regard to people not being able to contact their employees outside of working hours. And it's really interesting to see how that and some of those principles may or may not be sort of folded into UK working culture. So, I mean, there are plenty of statistics that are sort of available, and the ONS is a good place to go for those. But it's interesting, and I think it just shows that there is perhaps a bit of a disconnect between the reality and the perception, sort of depending on who you speak to.
And of course, we've seen some technology solutions in the meantime on your emails automatically cut off at a certain hour in the evening or start in the morning, and the same with your mobile phone. So there are for sure ways you can do it if you were to consider that. Yeah,
but we, and as Jacqui's touched on as well, I mean, we really need to be very careful when we're talking about discriminatory behaviour. I really enjoy that, or I thought it was very insightful, that quote from the lady from the Bank of England, Catherine Mann, when she was talking about the potential for a two-track system, those who are office-based and those who are remote-based. And the principle, I think, from this discussion and all the discussions that you'll be having in your workplaces is to make sure that as best you can, if you are encouraging hybrid or home working, you really need to make sure that you're putting safeguards and protections in to avoid that kind of discriminatory behavior, because it's a very fast-moving area for employment law. And I certainly don't see it getting any quieter. I don't know if Jacqui and Anni would agree.
But it's just having that caution, isn't it? Because ultimately, from a legal standpoint, if the company applies a provision or practice that could potentially put an employee who has a protected characteristic at some disadvantage. So mainly when we're thinking about hybrid work, and the obvious ones, as we've raised before, are gender or disability. If those pools of people are going to be at a disadvantage because of some shift in company policy, then that's not really a good place to be. And ultimately, you need to have a business plan in place and a justification for why you're turning down someone's request to maybe do like 100% homework, or in some cases it might be 100% office work, and who knows, it could be on the flip side. So we do need to think about those people with care and responsibilities. Maybe they've got kids at home, or maybe they look after vulnerable adults. Who knows? If you are as a company forcing a return to the office, could there be some potential for a discrimination claim being aimed at your business for those reasons? So you have to be able to justify your decision making from the top down.
Anni, any comments?
No, I just thought it's also very important that we then include that whatever is going to happen with your organization, what kind of model you want to go for, you definitely have to look at your processes, make sure that they are up to scratch. If there's anything which needs to be updating in terms of policies, and if there's any additional training needs which need to be looked at, since they're now not all in the office at any given time.
Yeah. Shall we move on to some questions, or do you have a few more things here?
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, so maybe we'll just go for the questions. And
exactly, because we can continue, and for everybody's information, in the chat function you'll see the respective email addresses of Jacqui, Anni, and Robert for any particular question you want to take with them you didn't get answered today, or indeed Jade and I from the Finnish-British Chamber and DKUK. The first one, I'm going to take it from Tony. He put it onto the question. Might be a difficult one to answer. What about the law around compulsory vaccine to have a job? A company is protected. Is that one you're able to touch upon?
I mean, there's been some really interesting bits in the news. I know we saw some stories about Next and IKEA and Morrison's, the supermarket chain, and they are talking about potentially not discriminating is the wrong word, but treating people differently based on or when it comes to sick pay, based on whether or not they are vaccinated or unvaccinated. But this is a really, really difficult area because, of course, you've got all kinds of difficulties when it comes to accessing special category or medical data. Under data protection laws, people can't generally be compelled to give you that kind of information if they don't want to. You need to fold all of the understanding that you do have perhaps into a risk assessment when it comes to COVID, and Jacqui's kind of talked about that. And actually, it's quite a specific point when we're talking about sick pay that's come up, and I think actually it ignores the potential for lots of other things that may inhibit somebody from getting a COVID vaccine. There may be a few different reasons why perhaps somebody doesn't want it or they're not able to get it. I don't want to kind of politicize this too much, but there is a line between what a company can reasonably request you to do and not. But Jacqui, do you want to make some comments on that one?
I mean, I think just bearing in mind we don't have too much time, but I think at the moment we don't have a solid answer that we can give, because ultimately, as with a lot of legislation, this will all come to light and we'll know what the right or wrong thing or what are the parameter for enforcement will be once more of these cases end up in court. So it is going to be very much driven by case law, which are, some are going to tribunal now for varying reasons, not specifically for the compulsory vaccine. But I think it will be quite a contentious topic for sure.
Am I right in thinking this is something that probably you in particular, Jacqui, but Goodwille, you're keeping on monitoring, and if that changes, people can go to you and talk to you about it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not necessarily about the vaccine, but we have actually had a case which was we don't know the company name. We'll call it Company Y, and the employee being Employee X. But actually, she was refusing to come to the workplace based on feeling unsafe. So exercising her statutory right of feeling that she felt in serious and imminent danger coming to work because of COVID. And so her employer stopped paying her. So she took her employer to tribunal. She basically indicated that she felt it was her philosophical belief that she was in danger of COVID, and that's why she shouldn't be coming to work. But actually, the ruling didn't go in her favor, so she lost. The tribunal, the judge ruled that he didn't dispute her concerns as being genuine, but he ruled that the fear didn't amount to a belief, describing it instead as a reaction to a threat and a need to reduce that threat. And ultimately, in that instance, her workplace had done the relevant COVID risk assessments. They'd made it as COVID safe as they possibly could. Which then allowed or gave the company some protection in that instance. So it's not quite the same as saying, it's a COVID vaccine or an argument on sick pay, but we are seeing more COVID related cases where there isn't any black and white legislation out there yet, but we are being driven by case law, and it's quite encouraging the fact that there is a way around some sticky situations.
Very good. I think we have time for one more question we got in advance, and I'm going to be selective here because it may be an opportunity. Will the companies not adapting to flexible working lose the war on talent? You touched a bit upon it. Actually, maybe an opportunity here for companies at the same time. Keep it brief, please.
Anyone want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Anni's talked about the potential for sort of untapped resources. We talk about people who maybe ordinarily would be put off by coming back to work if they had to be in an office 100% of the time, be on a commuter train in the morning and then not get home to their family until 6-7 o'clock in the evening. So there are definitely arguments on both sides. I think it's really interesting when we think about hybrid working and flexible working policies in the same way that we used to perhaps think that companies might compete over salaries. So if you had, let's take the big four accountancy firms as an example, and we think about their benefits packages, their salary offerings, generally speaking, there'll be a band or a range that are fairly similar. But actually one thing that particularly sort of, I don't know if it's, if you're supposed to say sort of generation Y, but maybe the sort of the new candidate market, the sort of 20 to 40-year-old bracket are really, really, really hot on and considering the flexible working and the hybrid policies. I would suggest probably on par with salary, because salary is something that actually is fairly kind of close together with companies that are operating in the same space. So I think it's just another way that companies need to be competitive. And to that end, Jacqui talked a lot about being able to objectively justify wanting somebody to come back to the office. If out of 4 businesses, you are the only one who's requiring people to be in the office 100% of the time, then it's likely that you will be isolating a number of people from the office. But I think for the opposing view, it could go very much the other way. And if you are the company that doesn't have an office, you're not based in central London, and actually somebody maybe wants to move there and have that culture, be able to go out for drinks after work with people and foster those kind of personal relationships, then if you are encouraging or you only have a fully remote option or a 4 out of 5 days at home, then again, you may be isolating a certain portion of the market. So ultimately, I think a blend is probably sensible, but you really need to consider what works best for you.
Mm. And can I just add on that, of course, there is other flexible working alternatives which maybe the organization can look at. So not just like hybrid working, polyworking. You can also, like Jacqui mentioned earlier, that you have a flexible working request which can be done, but also like job sharing, part-time, compressed hours, implement flexi time. There's many ways an employer can actually look at certain things to get it more flexible for everybody.
Cool. I think we should cut it here. We could continue, but really, I'm so appreciative that we can get this collective knowledge that you have here at Goodwille, and we can present it to the membership, and that's really what it's all about, and why you are engaging through associations like DKUK or the Finnish-British Chamber. So let's round it up, and thank you very much for your input today, Jacqui, Anni, and Rob, for your time and your wisdom. For everyone who's attended, do connect with them. You'll find in the chat their respective email addresses, and please do email them questions you have to engage and find out, or you have something back they could learn from. I'm sure they would be interested to hear that as well, to add to this discussion, looking at who has been attending here today. But with that, look us up in Finnish-British Chamber of Commerce website, Goodwill's website, or dkuk.org. There are plenty more to come, and engage with us how Goodwill are engaging here today. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.